Week 1 is in the books, and now that we've had some time to digest what we saw in Week 1, it is time to dive into some of the biggest losers. There's a lot of players and teams applicable here relative to the expectations we had for these said players and teams just 7 days ago, and we're going to discuss why they are exactly some of the biggest losers from the first week of the season. But just because they are on today's video does not necessarily mean they are doomed for the entire year, and in fact I would like to be proved wrong and have these guys play the best football of their lives for the rest of the year. But there were some players and teams, and even coaches for that matter, that I expected to take the next step in 2023, and granted they still could, as only one game out of 17 has been played, but some of what we saw in Week 1 was an absolute disaster, and there's no denying it even if you are a diehard fan of this team. And by the way, before we start, this is in no way a ranking of who the specific biggest loser is, and I did want to clear that up before we start, and with that being said, let's dive right in. And we are starting today's video with the Seattle Seahawks. Whenever we do weekly recaps, the game recaps are pretty quick because there's so many to get to in a short amount of time, but in videos like this, we can truly dive in. And I was a huge believer in Seattle heading into the year, and they got embarrassed at home by the Rams. And the Rams did this without 2021 Offensive Player of the Year in Cooper Kupp, and the Rams still had two 100-yard receivers in Puka Nacua and Tutu Atwell. And this team isn't close to the same Rams team that won a Super Bowl a year and a half ago, as they had 14 draft picks this year and are coming off of a very injury-plagued year in which they went 5-12. And I think it'd be one thing if the Seahawks lost this game in a close one like a 23-20 or a 20-17 game where it comes down to the wire and it simply gets away from you. But this wasn't anywhere close to that type of loss. And if you don't already know, take a guess as to what the Rams outscored the Seahawks in the second half. Obviously, you know it's going to be bad in a 17-point loss, but the Rams outscored Seattle 23-0 in the final 30 minutes of the game. And my biggest concern entering the year for Seattle was their run defense, as they got gashed several times last year, including 3 times by San Francisco alone, in what ended up being 3 separate losses to the 49ers. And you would think in a game where you lose by 17 points, that the Rams just chewed the clock in the second half and just wore them down with the ground game, but that was not the case. The Rams as a team had 40 carries for 92 yards, and yes, they had 3 rushing touchdowns, but they were all inside the 10-yard line, with 2 of those being 1-yard runs, so I don't put a lot of weight into giving up 3 rushing touchdowns in a game, specifically when you allow 2.3 yards per carry to the opposing team. Now, if Seattle allowed 5.3 yards per carry and also allowed 3 rushing touchdowns, it would obviously be a different discussion. But Cam Akers had 22 carries for 29 yards for an average of just 1.3 yards per carry, and that's insane for Seattle's defense, truly. But it's even crazier when you take out Akers' longest run of the day, which was only 12 yards, meaning Seattle held him to 17 yards on his other 21 carries. And honestly, I think that's one of the worst things about this loss for Seattle. Your run defense was nothing short of a liability in 2022, and more than held up, and your passing defense did not, and your pass rush didn't get home either, as Stafford was sacked 0 times in Week 1. And unfortunately for Seattle, this sounds like an old Billy Mays commercial, but wait, there's more, as their offense wasn't good either. They only held the ball for 20 minutes of this game and were just 2 of 9 on third down, compared to the Rams' 11 of 17 on third down, which, by the way, is downright insane, and the Seahawks only had 180 yards of total offense. This was one of my biggest surprises of the entire week, and it was just how bad Seattle played. They were outgained by 246 yards at home to a team that just finished with a top 6 draft pick and were down one of not just the best players on their roster, but one of the best players in the league. Granted, when you only have the ball for 20 minutes, it's obviously going to limit what you can do, but I was also disappointed with Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet combining for 15 total carries. This was all around an extremely ugly performance for Seattle, and like we mentioned in the weekly recap, they played Detroit in week 2, and this defense just played 78 total snaps and was on the field for a very long time. And with how dominant the 49ers looked against Pittsburgh, the start of this season worries me for Seattle. And with that mention of the 49ers, we are segueing into the next biggest loser from week 1, and it's the Pittsburgh Steelers. Well, sorry, let me correct that. Every Steeler not named TJ Watt. I don't want this entire video to be doom and gloom, but TJ Watt had a career game, and a game you write home about, as he had 3 sacks and 2 forced fumbles, and even had 5 quarterback hits. And in one game alone, that should be enough to keep your team competitive, but that was not the case, as the Steelers would go on to lose by 23 points in front of their fans at Acrisure Stadium. And there's several layers to this and why the Steelers came out as big losers, and we'll start with the offensive line. Kenny Pickett was sacked 5 times, which obviously doesn't do anybody any good, but this was supposed to be an improved unit, and if there is anything to say about this for the Steelers offensive line specifically, what I will say is this is going to be one of the best pass rushing units they'll play all year. So if there is anything to at least look on the bright side of things for the Steelers offensive line, it's that they're not going to face a unit like this for what could be the rest of the 2023 season. But Steelers fans know this all too well, and it's the frustration with offensive coordinator Matt Canada. I don't have a problem with the team spending a first-round pick on a running back. Extending them on a second contract for multiple years is a different discussion entirely, but you spent a first-round pick on Najee Harris 2 years ago, and you gave him 6 carries over the course of a 60-minute game. 6. Not 13 or 14 with 5 or 6 receptions out of the backfield, but 6 carries, and I have a big problem with that. And Kenny Pickett's depth of throws was also a problem because he didn't have time to throw and was being set up for failure. Granted, Kenny didn't play well either, and both of those things can be true, but to also have George Pickens, a player who I think can be a star receiver for some time in the NFL, to finish week 1 with 5 catches for 36 yards, with the longest reception of the day for him being just 9 yards, is pitiful. But it didn't stop there for the Steelers, as they were outgained by 150 yards in their own stadium, and they couldn't cover Brandon Ayuk, who had one of the best performances week 1 of any receiver. This, in a lot of ways, was truly a nightmare game for the Steelers, and San Francisco ran for 188 yards, held the ball for 37 minutes, and won the turnover battle. And I believe in the Steelers, but for them to start out with an absolute stinker in which their offensive play caller, quarterback, and offensive line were all, well, horrible, is very discouraging to start the year. Sure, you can justify it by saying it was the 49ers, who are expected to make a deep run this year, but to be outclassed in every way in this game, with the exception of TJ Watt of course, makes the Steelers one of the biggest losers in all of week 1. Next up may be a surprising one, but we're going to dive into this a little bit, and it's the Vikings and their play calling. You may look at the stat sheet and see Justin Jefferson had 9 catches for 150 yards in week 1 and say, yep, JJ's back, and it's unfortunate the Vikings lost because of silly turnovers. But what's really frustrating about the Vikings is Kevin O'Connell's play calling and the lack of urgency at times to put teams away and to simply put more points on the board. There were times in week 1 against Tampa where the Vikings would throw the ball to Justin Jefferson, who would be wide open, then spend the next 2 or 3 plays trying to force the ball on a backdoor screen to either CJ Ham or TJ Hawkinson or whoever, and in some cases Alexander Mattison. And I have no problem getting those guys the football, especially Hawkinson, considering he was just signed to a $17 million per year contract extension. But for TJ to finish the game with 8 catches for 35 yards is ridiculous. Push the ball downfield to him. And not only that, but Jordan Addison and Justin Jefferson in week 1 combined had 13 catches for 211 yards and a touchdown. Jordan, of course, had the big 39-yard touchdown, but as cliche as this sounds, when Kirk throws Justin the ball, it's like you expect a big chunk play to happen. And this offense in week 1 should have put up 25 or 30 points. They shot themselves in the foot time after time after time and ended up losing to the Baker Mayfield-led Bucs. And what's crazy is if they continue to throw the ball to Justin, who, by the way, had 7 catches for 138 yards in the first half, and go for it at the end of the game instead of punt it away, this team is 1-0 like they should be. Now, I'm not saying because you have Justin Jefferson and that because he is a better receiver than anyone else on the team by a considerable amount to throw him the ball 20 times a game every game, but he comfortably had 7 catches in the first half and to no fault of his own had just 2 catches in the second half. And the Vikings had a lot of crazy wins in 2022. Nobody would deny that. But if you want to take the next step as a team, which by the way they can as the defense was awesome in week 1, you have to be better offensively and get your guys the rock. Addison showed he can make plays in his debut, and Jefferson, as we know, obviously can and did, but I am advocating for KOC to stop the screen passes as much as they are called and give your top guys more opportunities to make plays. And on top of it for KOC, the long developing play action plays are not a good play call in this offense, with the interior offensive line being as much of a liability as they are. Ed Ingram specifically is one of the worst guards in the entire NFL. 17 points for this team in a game where Kirk outside of one play was on, and it's unacceptable. And what's unfortunate for the Vikings and why they are one of the biggest losers in week 1 is this was a must-win game because 3 of their next 4 games are against the Eagles, on the road by the way, the Chargers, and the Chiefs, and they got too cute and messed around and found out. Next up is the New York Giants, and this was a total pantsing of the Giants in their own stadium. This was actually so bad I released the Week 1 recap in the 4th quarter of this game. And to lose by 40 points in your season debut and home debut, coming off a season in which you won a playoff game is obviously bad, but this was a historically bad loss. This was the worst shutout loss in Giants franchise history, and seemingly nothing went right. And obviously we all know a 40-point loss at home is bad. I mean, that part is obvious, but what I think is honestly the worst part of this loss for the Giants was it wasn't like Dak Prescott played good and he was carving them up all night and threw for 350 yards and 3 touchdowns. In fact, he was rather pedestrian because he didn't need to have a good game, and he finished with completing a little over 50% of his passes and threw for just 143 yards. And the Cowboys still won by 40. And full disclosure, I thought the game was over when Deron Bland returned the pick 6 to make it 16-0, as this team is not built to play from behind, and I thought it would be a problem for them. And obviously it was, but I didn't think it would explode to the magnitude it did. The Giants' Week 2 game in Arizona is, well, obviously a must-win, but take a glance at their schedule in Weeks 3 through 6 and why this loss is so huge. They play in San Francisco, then play Seattle, then play in Miami and in Buffalo, and we could be talking about a team that's either 1-5 or 2-4 through 6 games for a team that had every aspiration to take the next step and to show they are ready to compete this year. For Dallas, I mean, what a performance. I love Dan Quinn as a coach, and it's only a matter of time until he is a head coach again. And this was an absolute masterclass by the Cowboys defense. And the Giants offensive line was absolutely awful. A 40-0 donut to start the season, fresh off of giving your quarterback a $160 million contract extension is, and this is not an exaggeration, one of the worst regular season games anybody has ever played. The Bengals were certainly losers in Week 1 as they were bad and Joe Burrow threw for under 100 yards, and the Browns defense played lights out, and a big credit goes to Jim Schwartz. But like we saw last year with Cincinnati, they bounced back and went to the AFC Championship game. Again, enough credit cannot be given to the Browns defense. But that's it for the Week 1 Biggest Losers. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please like the video and subscribe, as only about 24% of people watching are subscribed, and it makes a massive difference. My Patreon and Twitter links are in the description if you'd like to support the channel, and until next time, please be safe and have a great day. Love you guys.